All right, I'm Kimberly Collins. I'm one of the co-organizers of Free Code Camp OKC. We meet here pretty much every Sunday, usually at 2 o'clock like today, but do keep in mind that next week we're going to meet an hour earlier. You can find all those details on meetup.com, on our website also at fccokc.com. You can contribute through GitHub and find out more about our group there. Today we're going to have an introduction to CSS by Autumn.
Okay, hopefully the sound is okay. First, some housekeeping. On the Meetup page and on my Twitter site, I posted a link to the presentation. The reason for this is that I wanted to allow you to follow along with the code samples that we have, because I feel like the best way to get to know CSS is by futzing around with it. So feel free to open that link. When Kimberly invited me to give this presentation, I was giving a little happy dance because I spend my day with graphic designers who are always driving home how important design is to everything in life, really, they would probably say. But it's especially important to websites because the design of your web page can be a key differentiator if you have a competitor. And it can also, if you have no design to your website, it can drive your audience away, because I'm sure that some of you have been to websites that look like they were designed in 1995, and you kind of want to escape as quickly as possible. So that's what CSS is. It's going to be how you design and format your web pages. So we'll get started. The agenda for today is that we'll cover an introduction to CSS. We will talk a little bit about syntax and selectors. We'll get into cascade priority. And then at the end of the talk, because what you really want to know is how to use the CSS in your HTML, we'll talk about that a little bit and then cover some tips and resources. The great news is that CSS is really easy to learn. So by the end of this hour, you will know about 80% of what you're going to need to know to design your web pages. And then the tips and resources will give you some ideas on how to further your knowledge about CSS, because even though you'll know 80%, there's still, that 20% is pretty complex. So, okay, what is CSS? CSS is cascading style sheets. The style sheet part is a way of applying a uniform style to your web pages. And then the cascading part is, there's two parts to that. One is that there's this idea of an inheritance in CSS. And so certain page elements will inherit properties from other page elements. And then there's also this idea of cascading, because there are 3 different style sheets that could be applied to your web page. So like a waterfall will cascade a certain, if there are several waterfalls that all cascade into the same pool, it's the same with CSS, where you can have multiple style sheets that are all cascading style properties onto your web page. The first of these is your browser style sheet. So the browser style sheet is what's built into your browser, and it will have very basic styling. So your headers, H1 elements will have a certain size and a certain weight to it, which will be bigger than the paragraph font. And then the web page style sheet is what you, the developers, are responsible for, and that's what we'll be covering. And then there's also a user style sheet. So a user style sheet is usually going to be incorporated by extensions to your browser, and sometimes people will have reasons for why they want to apply their own style sheet, such as probably the most commonly used example is for accessibility purposes. If your users have low vision, they might want to have their fonts be a bigger size, or they might want high contrast colors on the page. This notion of cascading is very important to cascading style sheets, and we'll go into that in a little bit of detail shortly. The importance of CSS is being able to separate your style from content. So this is extremely important, actually. I built my whole career on this, basically. This idea that you have this content in your page, and then you apply a style sheet, and you can change that style sheet very easily. So this is very important for companies who need to go through a rebranding phase. And I don't think you realize, like 20 years ago, this was extremely difficult. It cost companies millions of dollars. So being able to separate your style from your content is pretty revolutionary. All right, so let's take one example of this. I'm going to open an example web page. Oh, I have this here. Okay, so here is a web page. You can see it looks very basic because this is only using the browser style sheet. And so it has, a very basic unordered list. This image is absolutely massive, so you can't even tell what's in the image. There are some comments down below, some pretty basic buttons. You can see that there are some links here that don't really have any styling applied to it. So this is a basic web page without any styling applied to it. Now let's go ahead and alter this a little bit. We'll just go ahead and uncomment the link, and we'll cover this in a little bit as well, but we're just going to add in a link to a CSS style sheet. And so now when we reload the page, you can see that the image is resized, and you can actually tell what's on the image. Those links that I was mentioning before have now been moved to a sidebar, and there's some color, and it just looks a lot prettier. And that is basically what you want from your CSS, is to make a pretty web page. So let's go into a little bit, sorry about that. Okay. Now, what are we doing with the CSS? CSS syntax, basically, this is it. You have a selector. You'll have curly brackets containing a property, or more than one property, possibly, and a colon separating the property from the value, and then the value. The property comes from a list of available properties from the CSS standard, and values will also be constrained. Your properties can include things like background color. So you can see here, maybe a little bit vaguely, but behind this code for the selector, there is a little bit of background color applied. It's a gray background. You can also apply a box shadow. A box shadow will make the box that's there stand out a little bit. You can apply a border style, like a solid line, a dashed line, a double line. Another property is setting columns for your page or for a part of the page. And then there are many more. And this link will take you to a reference page where you can, keep forgetting about my mouse, CSS reference, where you can view all of these CSS properties on the left-hand side. So that'll take you through the many, many properties that you could apply to your web pages. When we're talking about selectors, this first part of our syntax, you can select your parts of your HTML page in multiple ways. One of those ways that you can select is by selecting the HTML element. And to do that, you really just need to write out the element and then use your curly brackets to start your property and value list. This is for your standard style definitions. So almost every CSS file is going to have at least one HTML element in it with definitions, because that's going to be how you set up your web page. Now, we do have this try it link where we can open this up, and I just use jsfiddle.net for all of these. Even though we're not using JavaScript, you can still test out with your HTML and CSS. So you can play around with the background color here. Maybe, oh, goodness gracious. gracious. Maybe we'll just set a regular color like, I think powder blue is one maybe. Right. So you can play around with that if you have that open. But so now we're setting, you can see that the background color is set for the entire body, just because that background color is applied to the body element. We can also select parts of the HTML page by the attribute class. In this particular case, I've set a class value of important, and for this we're setting a font size and a font weight. And then when we're ready to apply that in the HTML, we just have to make sure that this class attribute can be used on pretty much every element within your HTML page. Just make sure that you set that class attribute to the value that you want to look that way. And so this is for applying an overlay style. We'll get into later about how you can set inline styles. This is a much better way to, or easier way to do it, because then now you can apply this class to pretty much any part of your web page. So you don't have to specify every single time what those styles are going to be. And this is I actually used this important CSS setting in my slide deck, which I will show you in the next page. But so again, if we wanted to, I did not note this in the slide, but you can set a comment with just an angle bracket, or an angle, what do you call those, / star to start your comment, and then a * to end it. So once we run this, it loses its bold setting. We could also try setting font style to italic, and press run. Okay, so there we go. That is selecting by class attribute. We might also select by the ID attribute. And this is for a one-time setting, because an ID by its nature is something that can only be used once in your page. So you definitely want to limit your usage of this for specific page elements that need a specific style. And I should have pointed out here. Okay, so for class, you just make sure that you have the dot in front of the class name. So that's the important differentiator between your element and your class. And the differentiator for an ID is a hashtag or a number sign. I don't know if it's called a hashtag in CSS. So, by the way, this is where I use the important CSS style. Okay, trying this one out. Now here, we have set it up so that this particular block is going to be listed as an ID of quote. So you might have at the top of your page, some pages, articles will start with a quote. And so this is one way that you could potentially set it up, is style that quote as being something that stands apart from the rest of your page. Your selectors can be combined by listing them out with a comma separator. In this case, we have H1, H2, and H3. What this means is that all three elements are going to have the same property applied to them. And then later on in your CSS style sheet, you can list out further details for H1 or H2 or H3, but this is just one way of combining something. All of these are going to look the same with this font weight of normal. And then down below, you can do the same thing with classes, the class attribute, or with your ID attributes, or really any other selector. You just need to make sure that you list them out with a comma separator. Oh, yes, go ahead. If you list the same ID, would it apply multiple elements. Okay. Apply the style to multiple elements. Okay. You can only use the ID once, though. So are you saying if you use different IDs there?
I'm asking, is that a rule that we just abide by out of standard, or is it browser enforced?
I believe it is browser enforced. It is actually part of the HTML standard. Yeah. Good question. Okay. Selectors can also be refined, which means that in this example here, we have a P followed by a space followed by strong. So these are elements because they don't have a dot identifier or a hash identifier. So your paragraph element and a strong element. This means that this background color style only applies to strong elements that are within a paragraph element. So that's the way you can kind of narrow down your focus. And let's have a look at that real fast. So we've set the background color to yellow for the strong element, but only within the paragraph. So you'll notice that this strong element is not in a paragraph, it's in a list item. And therefore, it does not have the yellow background. It's not styled the same way. Yes, question. Is there a limit to how far you can chain that to traverse the DOM? Not that I know of. I've never run into a limit. Have you? Anybody? Yeah, so I have seen some pretty crazy chains, by the way, if you look at the code that people run into. But
can that also be like be strong and then you have a div in there and you want to target a certain class?
yes,
Okay.
yeah, yes. So, and that's the other thing is that you can also, again, this is something that you can chain together with any selector. So if you have a P that contains something with a class of important, you could focus in on that particularly. So it would be P space period important. All right, so that covers the basic syntax. However, you could, there are many other selector types. Well, I wouldn't say many other, but there are a few other selector types. And for that, I will put a resource at the end if you are interested in finding out additional ways that you can select. I kind of wanted to keep it to the basics for now. Moving on to the cascading portion of cascading style sheet. First, there's this inheritance. There are properties that are inherited by their child elements. Color is a good example of this. Direction for your language, left to right or right to left. Font family is another property that gets inherited by the elements. And so what I mean by this is that if you set you set one of these styles on the body element, this means that the paragraphs inside the body are also going to adopt these styles. Then there are the properties that are not inherited by your child elements. Some examples of these, usually like when you're thinking about the layout, it's the boxes. So border, margin, and padding are kind of around the box. And so those are the types of properties, style properties that are not going to be inherited. Because you wouldn't want your border on your body element to also be a border on the paragraph, which what that would mean would be there'd be like nested, solid lines everywhere within your page. I think this is mostly common sense when you are thinking about which properties that you want to inherit. You'll kind of just know. But if you don't, if you're worried about this, then there are references where you can look up to see if these properties actually are inherited or not. You can also force inheritance with the inherit property value. In this particular case, we have a class called inherit, and then we're talking about an a link within this class inherit, an a element. So this color property is now set to inherit. I did mention that color is something that is inherited by the child elements. However, one of the exceptions to this rule is with your links. And the reason for this is because most of the time we want a visual indicator of what a link is on a page, right? So we've kind of gotten used to seeing that link is going to be in a different color and with an underline. Well, in a particular case, you might not want that color to change, and you just want to identify it with the underline. So the way that you would do this is you would set up something like this, where color is inherit. You're not setting the color to a particular color because you just want it to look the same as the surrounding text. And so for that, that color inherit tells us that the link should be in the same color as the rest of the text in that list item. An important thing to remember with CSS is that all of your rules get applied. Here we have two rules, and I failed to mention this earlier, but this whole bracketed section is a rule, considered a rule. So we have here a rule for a strong element within a P element, and we have a rule for just a single strong element. Well, combined, there are 4 different properties, but 2 of them are the same. So what I mean by all rules get applied means that just because there's a conflict of this color doesn't mean that if one of these colors is rejected, then the partner property will also be rejected. So what happens is the browser will check, it will apply every single of these styles, background color, text decoration, and then the color, where there's a conflict, it will resolve that conflict by the property and just discard whichever one doesn't make the cut. Whoopsie, okay. So, and we'll get into the prioritizing here, but what's important to know is that you'll see that this is a strong element within a paragraph. We have a background color of yellow that's applied. We have a color of blue. This is also applied. And we have a text decoration of underline, which is also applied. Color, however, green is not applied. So we'll explain why that is in just a moment. So 3 of the 4 style properties got adopted, I guess you could say. Now, prioritizing the cascade. This is always the fun part. Conflicts are resolved in the following order. The most important aspect is the importance. The second, if importance cannot, if there's still a conflict after the importance has been evaluated, then your browser will look at the specificity of the CSS rules. And then the third thing is, if it still can't figure out which one to discard, then it will look at the source order. So we'll explain those in detail. Importance. If you use the tag !important, if that's declared, then the property always takes precedence. So here we have, well, I'm just going to open this in the code editor so you can take a look at it. All right, so we have 3 paragraphs here. One of them is your normal paragraph. One of them has this class attribute of note. And then there is, this list item is not actually a paragraph, it's just a list item. So you can see that we have style definitions for the paragraph and we have style definitions for the note. The important aspect here is that they both define a border, but you'll note that we use the declaration !important for the paragraph. This means that even for the paragraph class attribute note, even though background color is set to gray and the color is set to white, this border setting does not override the border that's set to none because of this important declaration there. Furthermore, when we're talking about importance, we are talking about, it's determined, the order of importance is determined based on where that style resides, on which style sheet. So your most important style sheet declarations are going to be the important declarations that are established in your user style sheets, which means the ones that are in your extensions, as I mentioned. This one overrides the important declarations that are in you, the developer's web page style sheets. Underneath that one is the normal declarations in your web page style sheets, and that overrides the normal declarations in the user style sheets. So notice that there's a little bit of a flip-flop there. Normally, what the user wants is going to be overridden by what the web page tells the browser to style it as. Because in a lot of cases, the web page should probably, or the website developers should probably have the say in how that should look, because you have an overall vision for how you want your page to look. So that's why there is, your declarations normally supersede the users. However, like in cases with accessibility, there's some people who really, really cannot have certain styles applied to their, to be able to understand a website, they have some requirements. So that's why there's, there are provisions in there for, yes, the user can override some things, but they can't in other places, and then where user has the final say. And then, of course, at the bottom of this list is the declaration in your browser style sheets, because those are not terribly important. So it's just the basic style sheet. Now, if by looking at the importance, the browser can't tell which one should take priority, it will then look at the specificity of the rule. The more narrow or the more specific that definition, the higher the priority, which means that in this particular case where we have, we're going back to that same example where the strong element within the P, within the paragraph, is going to have some settings. So now if we go back to that, we can explain that the reason that the color is set to blue instead of green here is because this declaration is far more specific, because that strong element is only appearing in the paragraph element. Now, we could probably spend a half an hour going over the rules of specificity. This is a pretty complex algorithm, and if you are interested in it, they have they assign mathematical numbers to different selectors and combinations of selectors and so on. So that could be fun reading for some people. But basically what we need to know is the order of importance for the mainly used selectors, and that's your ID selector. This makes sense. It's going to be the most important because there's only one there. So if you're specifying that this one element should look this way, then yeah, it should. The second one is going to be the class selector. So that's of slightly less importance. And then the third one is the element selector. So those are how you could probably argue that in some cases a class might be less specific, but that is the rule that the CSS standard writers decided on. Finally, if we still cannot figure out which one should take priority, then the browser looks at the source order. Later rules will beat out your earlier ones. Normally, this would not happen. It's pretty rare that I've seen, the same styles applied to the same element in the same style sheet. So here we have, because this is the last one defined, now this paragraph is going to look red. But where this really does apply is when you are talking about multiple style sheets, the order in which you call in those style sheets is where you're going to run into this issue. So that the last imported style sheet is going to have final say. So something to keep in mind when you are writing out your web pages, writing out your HTML. All right, so that basically covers our cascading. Now we're going on to how do we use the CSS in your web pages. First up, we have our inline styles. In this case, you can apply a style attribute to almost every HTML element. And with that, you just define the style property, the CSS style property, and the property value. Notice in this case, there is no selector. And the reason for that is because we don't need a selector. We're on the element that it applies to. So this is the one case where you don't have to worry about the selector. And this is useful if, note, because this is on the element that it's going to apply to, this is as specific as it gets, right? So this is going to take priority over almost everything else in your style sheets, which means that this is a good, quick way to set a style in your HTML, especially if you're working with code that multiple people are working on and you just want to override what they're doing. But that can also make people angry, so you just have to be very careful about where you use that style attribute. We also have a way of setting styles within the web page in the head element of the HTML page. And so that would be set in a style element. You can see that we have 3 selectors here with the associated property, style properties and their values. Now this is what I actually used. Let's go ahead and look at this page source. For the slide deck that I have, the reason being that this slide deck is just a one-off. It's a one-page HTML web page. And so for that reason, there's not really a need to call in an extra style file, CSS file, especially because now this makes it very easy to transport. So I was just able to copy this into my GitHub folder to make it available to you. So when you need something that's self-contained, this is the perfect way to do that. And you can see that this is where I defined the important class style definition. I also added one for pink. I'm using the remark library for this slide deck, and so they also have a couple of built-in styles. But it's a pretty simple style sheet. And last but not least, this is probably the most commonly used way of importing styles into your HTML web page, and that's with the link element, the link tag in your head, HTML head. It always looks about the same, which is this link tag has a rel attribute with the value of style sheet, so that lets the browser know that this is the style sheet. And then we have the location of that style sheet. So if we go back to the one page I opened earlier, as noted, you can have multiple CSS, multiple links to multiple style sheets. And that's what we have here. And as we previously discussed, the second one is the one that overrides previous ones. So you'll notice I just grabbed this web page from I downloaded a free CSS template. And so they have this built in. So this is built on the Bootstrap library. And they actually wrote this instruction: override the CSS file by adding your own CSS rules to the second CSS file. So that's pretty well known, pretty easy to override. Yes, question? Oh,
self-closing, like the break statement or break tag?
yeah. So I think that, I mean, if I had been writing this, I would have added that closing. It's not necessary, but it's just one of those things where if you like your code clean, then you add it. It's not technically necessary, though. But yes, good observation. Oh boy, we're going to finish a lot earlier than I expected. Okay. All right, last but not least is our tips and resources. Now, the fun part is getting to play with your CSS. And the best way to do this, Caitlin mentioned, if you were here last week for HTML, the HTML introduction, Caitlin showed the developer tools. And it's the same for CSS. It's a lot of fun. So we'll go back to this web page. If you right-click on a particular element of this page, so we're going to right-click on this one, we can go to this Inspect menu item. All right, so on the left-hand side, we have our HTML source for this page. And then on the right-hand side, you'll see all of the styles that are being applied to this page. It typically goes from the most important to least important here. And you can see that, first of all, it gives a source of where that style is defined. You can do things like, I just think this is so much fun. You can turn off styles. So if we go ahead and uncheck this, you can see that we lost, well, the reason why is this color, the font color is in white, and so we lost pretty much everything there in that first category. We can also play around with changing the color. This is extremely useful because sometimes you just want to see what your changes are going to look like in the web page. And so this makes it like a real-time design tool. All right, so we can, if you click on that little color area, it allows you to choose the color. We'll turn this brown a little bit. And press enter here. Actually, I should probably copy that. We'll copy that, double click here and paste it in. So now we can see what that will look like with a little bit of brown coloring to it. I think Caitlin mentioned this last week as well, but you have to be very careful when you're playing with these developer tools because this is just a way of viewing what it's going to look like. It does not actually change the source. So if you're making a lot of changes, just be careful. Don't press the refresh button because then you'll lose everything you've done, and that is frustrating. So let's take a look at some other things that we can do with this. We can also, you'll notice here, let's take a look at this one. Okay, you can see that when we, it might be kind of hard to see on the screens, but when you hover over these categories, it kind of changes the background color a little bit. And the way that you can inspect that is you can filter by element state here. So that's what's in this top corner. And you can click this hover area. And so that will help you identify where, so you can see that when we're in the hover state, that's where the background color will get assigned. And if we turn that off, then no hover happens, or no change happens with the hover. We can also, I'm going to go back to that other one. In this element.style, this allows you to set overriding styles. So if you don't want to make the changes directly in where somewhere else will be, you know, like say you're going to actually change that styles.css that gets imported, you can make the changes here and see how it's going to, whether it's going to override the previous style settings or not. So what we might do is we'll use this border top left radius. I am not extremely proficient in using this tiny mouse, so that is why this takes a while. Okay, so we'll go back in there and use that, and we'll set it to maybe 12 pixels. And you can see right away it updates to make a more rounded corner. And then as soon as I set that, I'm not sure if you noticed, but this one got crossed out. So when you see the crossed out values or styles, that means that that is something that is set, but it's overridden by one of the other style settings. Now, if you're interested in finding out which of the style settings are overriding it, because that can be kind of difficult to track down if you have many different style sheets, then what you want to do is you want to look at this computed tab here, and you can see that it lists out every single CSS style that is used within this web page. And then if you if you expand it out by pressing on this arrow, you can see that there's actually multiple settings for color, but the one that takes priority is this one that's most specific here. So that's the one that's going to be used for the color of the font in this particular case. All right, so that's some basics of using your developer tools to design your web pages. Have fun with that. We also can look at, so that's one of the things I did. I did a search for free CSS templates. You can find dozens of them on the internets. And then you can, many of them have them available to download, so you can take a look at what is being used within the CSS files that are defined within those. So that's a great place to start if you're looking for just some general ideas on how you want to design your web page. There's the CSS Tricks website that has running articles, so it's updated all the time with new articles about CSS, and it's kind of fun to see what they do, what you can do with CSS. It's really quite amazing. We also have a CSS reference. So the one I linked to previously, that was W3 Schools. The reason I didn't put this in prior to this is because when you look at the CSS reference, this is provided by Mozilla, you can see that they just sort everything by keyword, and this is an extremely massive list of keywords. So if you're just looking for the styles that you can apply, you'll probably want to use the other link that I gave you. But this provides a lot of detailed information. So see, look, I did tell you a lot about CSS, but there's so much more you can learn. I don't want to take the fun away from you. We have our selectors. These are the three that I mentioned. We also have a universal selector, an attribute selector. So there's more details on how you can find the parts of the page that you want to update. There are also pseudo classes and pseudo elements that can help you identify places such as the before and after, which is like the space before the element and the space after the element. And then this has information about the concepts of CSS. And so I think that's pretty handy if you are looking to get into the nitty-gritty of CSS. And finally, there is the standard, which is, I've linked to the W3C site. I don't think anybody else reads the standards, the specifications like I like to, but I think it's kind of fun to know how things should work, even if they don't. And so the way that you find that out is by going to the specifications. And the W3C maintains many different documents about CSS. They've done a lot of fun things with CSS, I think. So when I'm talking about CSS here, I'm mostly talking about HTML, your web pages, but you can use CSS sometimes with page layout. So there are some CSS rendering engines that can help you with your page layout. So if you want to find out more details about that, you'd probably come look in the W3C site. They have some specifications about how, page layout with I forget what it's called, CSS box or CSS module or something like that. So anyway, that's where you find out more information about CSS in the standard. And I think that's it. So do you want to do announcements now or questions first?
Are there any quick questions?
Okay, go ahead.
How would you approach handling differences in the way different browsers represent your CSS? Kind of make everything look the same across different browsers.
Okay. The question was, how would you approach the differences in browsers and how they render the CSS? Okay, so that is tricky, and that's a good question. First of all, you can look up which CSS CSS style properties are supported by a browser. There's a resource called "Where is this used?" or something like that. Can I use? That's right. Thank you, Kimberly. So caniuse.com is where you can find out if it actually is supported by other browsers. I also recommend that you do testing in, you can use the developer tools. I showed you the Chrome developer tools, but those are available in every browser. So I don't have any specific tips for making sure that you unify it. For me, it's always been trial and error and trying to find what looks best for each browser. And then you can get into tricky stuff like JavaScripting. And I think actually if you start with a library like Bootstrap, then it has considered that already for a lot of browsers. And so that can be pretty helpful, starting with a library that's already existing and has dealt with that particular issue. Good question. Yes?
When we're linking in external style sheets, I see on the slide that you did it in the head part. Is it important what portion we link to the style sheet in?
Yes. Yeah, I highly recommend doing it at the head, like within the head. And the reason for that is because when the browser is loading your page, it will have all that CSS ready for you. Okay, so I did not repeat the question, and the question the question is it important where you link to the CSS? Yes, question.
What is the user style sheet?
So the user style sheet is going to be, different browsers will have different ways of handling that. So it's a client-side style sheet. And like Chrome has an API that will actually let you define the style sheet. So it's mostly used if you have a Chrome extension, like you can look up, there are Chrome extensions for accessibility that will build a, so basically it uses that Chrome API to set up the user style sheet in the best way for people with low vision. Which enhancement suite?
When you're using reddit.com, there's an extra plugin that you can install called the enhancement suite. Site, as far as functionality and everything else that goes into it.
Yes, I think that is probably using that, actually. So the Granite, is that what you? Oh, Reddit enhancement suite. Oh, I did not realize that, huh? I've always just used the Reddit browser, or the standard Reddit view. But yes, the Reddit enhancement suite probably does use the user style sheets.
Can you talk a little bit about the box model? Someone Twitch is asking if you can provide a resource.
Okay, can I provide a resource for using the box model? That I would have to look up, actually. I don't have one off the top of my head that I could use for that. Yes, I don't really have a whole lot to say about that, actually. Sorry. But yeah. That will have to be covered in CSS Part 2, which will probably be taken on by somebody else. Yes, okay. All right, well, thank you.